بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. وبعد, so we inshallah بإذن الله this evening cover الفصل الثاني from أسرار الصيام, and the section is أسرار الصوم وشروطه الباطنة. So the last few weeks we looked at the conditions of fasting and we looked at the consequences of breaking our fast, and we are going to now look at the internal conditions of fasting and areas of fasting that people do not often consider. So he says اعلم, and when I say he, of course, Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah ta'ala, he says, اعلم أن الصوم ثلاث درجات. So firstly, know that fasting is of three categories, i.e. the people when it comes to fasting. He says, صوم العموم وصوم الخصوص وصوم خصوص الخصوص. So he says the fasting of the general people, the fasting of those who are perhaps a bit more qualified in their fasting, i.e. their actions, they are those who are perhaps special, you can say. And then صوم خصوص الخصوص, those who are from the special of the special, the elite when it comes to fasting. And perhaps you can say the crème de la crème. He says أما صوم العموم, as for the fasting of the general masses, what is it? He says فهو كف البطن والفرج عن قضاء الشهوة كما سبق تفصيله. He says the general understanding of fasting, or the fasting that is generally engaged in by the masses, is to abstain from the consumption of food and drink, and likewise from intimacy with one's spouse. That's it. And he says this is what was spoken about previously. Then he says وَأَمَّا صَوْمُ الْخُصُوصِ, as for those who are special from amongst the general masses of the Muslims, he says فَهُوَ كَفُّ السَّمْعِ وَالْبَصَرِ وَاللِّسَانِ وَالْيَدِ وَالرِّجْلِ وَسَائِرِ الْجَوَارِحِ عَنِ الْآثَامِ. He says that it is to abstain from basically sinning with the hand, the leg, the ear, the eye, i.e. sound, sight, the tongue, and every other part of our bodies. And so the general masses, when they fast, they don't eat or drink, and they don't engage in intimacy with their spouse. But you might find that they are engaging in haram with their tongues, engaging in haram with their eyes, engaging in haram with their ears, with their hands, etc. As for those who they are more qualified in their worship, i.e. they have a closer relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they abstain from sin as well as abstaining from food and drink. So in reality, they're fasting with their entire body, but they are fasting from the haram with their body. And of course, they should be doing so outside of Ramadan anyway. But in Ramadan, they place more emphasis on this. He says, وَأَمَّا صَوْمُ خُصُوصِ الْخُصُوصِ, as for the fasting of the cream of the crop, those who are special from amongst the special servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, i.e. the elite servants of Allah, the elite worshippers. He says, فَصَوْمُ الْقَلْبِ عَنِ الْهِمَمِ الدَّنِيَّةِ وَالْأَفْكَارِ الدُّنْيَوِيَّةِ وَكَفُّهُ عَمَّا سِوَى اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ بِالْكُلِّيَّةِ. He says it is to fast with the heart from any concerns or intentions which are lowly. And likewise, to fast from thoughts related to the dunya, and to fast with the heart from anything other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in totality. So the heart becomes detached from the dunya, becomes detached from that which is linked to the dunya, and becomes attached to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone for the duration of Ramadan. That's the fasting of the khusus al-khusus. And of course, that's a level which takes a long time to get to. He says, وَيَحْصُلُ الْفِطْرُ فِي هَذَا الصَّوْمِ بِالْفِكْرِ فِي مَا سِوَى اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ. He says that the way a person breaks his fast here is by thinking about other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and thinking about other than the akhirah. Meaning, he might still be fasting with his body, but the fasting of the heart is broken when someone thinks about other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, وَبِالْفِكْرِ فِي الدُّنْيَا إِلَّا دُنْيَا تُرَادُ لِلدِّينِ. And by way of thinking about the dunya, unless it's dunya which you want and you require for the sake of your deen. And in saying that, إِلَّا دُنْيَا تُرَادُ لِلدِّينِ, dunya which is sought out for deen, that's the asl when it comes to dunya anyway. What is the purpose of the dunya? The purpose of the dunya is to serve as a base for us to establish our deen. But today the dunya has become what? We seek dunya for the sake of dunya. We seek this life for the pleasures of this life. Whereas in reality, you should seek this life in order to establish that which is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whereas today, it's the opposite. We seek this life because we want this life. We want the pleasures of this life. Money is sought after for money itself. Whereas previously, amongst the righteous, money would be sought after. Why? So that it could be spent in the path of Allah. And then he says, فَإِنَّ ذَلِكَ مِنْ زَادِ الْآخِرَةِ وَلَيْسَ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا. The one who seeks the dunya for the sake of deen, that's from really the akhirah and not from the dunya. Why? Because you're using it as a medium to your akhirah. وَهَذِهِ رُتْبَةُ الْأَنْبِيَاءِ وَالصِّدِّقِينَ وَالْمُقَرَّبِينَ. He says, at this level, i.e. the fasting of the elites, the fasting of the body and the heart, from everything other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is the fasting engaged in by the prophets and the siddiqeen and the muqarrabeen. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us from them. He says, وَأَمَّا صَوْمُ الْخُصُوصِ فَهُوَ صَوْمُ الصَّالِحِينَ فَهُوَ كَفُّ الْجَوَارِحِ عَنِ الْآثَامِ وَتَمَامُهُ بِسِتَّةِ أُمُورٍ. As for the sawm, or the fasting of the special servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is the fasting of the salihun, fasting of the salihin. That's the fasting that we should be aiming for initially. And he says it is to abstain with the limbs from everything which is considered to be a sin. He says, وَتَمَامُهُ بِسِتَّةِ أُمُورٍ. And its completion is via 6 things. الْأَوَّلُ غَضُّ الْبَصَرِ. The first, by lowering the gaze. When we say غَضُّ الْبَصَرِ, what does it mean? Lowering the gaze.
Lowering the gaze from anything displeasing to Allah.
Lowering the gaze from anything displeasing to Allah. But what? Give me some examples.
Look at women,
Yeah, looking at women. Anything else? Women that we're not married to, of course. Anything else?
Dunya as well.
Exactly. So Ghaddul Basar, sometimes we only consider looking at haram. But Ghaddul Basar actually includes not looking at the dunya. So lowering our gaze from the dunya. And this is something which many of us, we fall short on. So you see a beautiful car. You lower your gaze. Why? It's not that you're attracted to the car. Nowadays, Allahumma musta'an, you have to be careful with your words. But it's that you don't want the dunya to creep into your heart. You don't want to start thinking, I want that car. You see someone wearing some fine clothes, you look down, you look away. Why? So that your heart doesn't become attracted to the luxuries of this life. And that's a practice of the salihin, a practice of the awliya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They look away from not only that which is haram, but from that which is halal, so that their hearts do not become attached to it. When you're fasting, do you stand there and stare at food? No, you don't. You don't. If you saw someone who's fasting and they're staring at food, you say, what's wrong with you, brother? You know, you're going to end up making it more difficult for yourself. But likewise, we act the same way with the dunya. We're supposed to be abstaining from the dunya. We're supposed to be fasting from this dunya until we die. And then we have our iftar when we meet Allah. But what happens is you have people there just staring at the dunya constantly, staring at what they don't have, and they become attached to it and they run after it. And nowadays, with these smart devices, unfortunately, before, to engage in window shopping, you actually had to go out to the shops and look in the windows. But now you have window shopping in the palm of your hand, where you have individuals that are staring and looking and browsing and searching and looking at things that they don't have that they would like, and their hearts become attached to them. And this, it leads to depression. As Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah, he said what? He said depression comes from 2 things. Number 1, running after the dunya. Number 2, a lack of relationship with Allah, a deficiency in relationship with Allah. 2 areas. So when we say lowering the gaze, we should lower the gaze from the dunya as well. It's not just from the haram, but from the dunya. I have a house, I see a lovely, massive, beautiful villa, I look away. Why? So that I don't start to yearn for this house. He says, وَكَفُّهُ عَنِ الْإِبْتِسَاعِ فِي النَّظْرِ إِلَى كُلِّ مَا يُذَمُّ وَيُكْرَهُ. Likewise, to lower the gaze from everything which is despicable or detestable or disliked. And this is again something that unfortunately we don't engage in. So lowering our gaze when we see haram. Not only when I say when we see haram, not haram that we shouldn't be looking at, when we see people engaging in haram. So I see someone drinking alcohol, I should look away. Why? I don't know, it might affect my heart. I see someone smoking, I should look away. This is the approach that ideally we should have. But the problem is we live in a society where haram and makruh and these things have become so prevalent, it's very difficult to look away because it's everywhere. And so we have to try our best and definitely lower our gaze from the luxuries and the pleasures of this dunya. We shouldn't look to the dunya and the dunya that has been opened up for others and say, I wish I had what they have. No. This is, what did the Prophet ﷺ say? They have it in this life, you have it in the next. When Umar al-An came and saw him sleeping on the palm tree leaves, and Umar al-An began to cry and weep and said, Ya Rasulullah, the kings of this dunya, they have the luxuries, etc. And you, the Messenger of Allah, you're sleeping like this. And he said, Umar, are you not pleased? They have it in this life, we have it in the next. Likewise, why is it that we're prohibited from drinking from gold and silver and so on and so forth? There's an element there of not being attached to the luxuries and the pleasures of this life. So then he says, وَإِلَى كُلُّ مَا وَإِلَى كُلِّ مَا يُشْغِلُ الْقَلْبَ وَيَلْهِي عَنْ ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ. Likewise, a person should lower their gaze, i.e. look away. You don't have to literally lower your gaze, but look away from everything which busies the heart and leads the heart away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so this is a way that we should live, generally speaking, to the best of our ability. Apply this to every aspect of life and life will change. Apply it to your friends, friendship. If I have friends that are constantly reminding me of the dunya, then they're not good friends. If I cannot remind them of Allah, if I can't remind them of Allah and they're constantly reminding me of the dunya, then I cut those friends off and I make new friends. I shouldn't keep friends with people that are reminding me of the dunya or calling me to haram if I cannot influence them. Either I influence them or they influence me. In the household, removing things that distract me from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Removing things from my life that distract me from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, الثاني. Remember, we're talking about that which leads to a complete siyam, i.e. siyam al-salihin, which is to fast not only with the stomach and the private part, but to fast with the entire body from everything displeasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, الثاني حفظ اللسان عن الهذيان والكذب والغيبة والنميمة والفحش والجفاء والخصومة والمراء. So this again, just think about what he's saying, apply it to fasting and outside of fasting, because we're not in the month of Ramadan currently. He says to prevent and to protect the tongue from al-hadayan, which is basically irrational talk. Just, it's like, what do they call it? Small talk, just unnecessary talking. Likewise, al-kadib, preserving the tongue from lying. Wal-ghiba, preserving the tongue from backbiting. Wal-namima, preserving the tongue from namima. What's namima? Namima is to take something which was said about a person by one person to that person. And sometimes it's done in goodwill. A person says, oh, I'm just letting you know, this person has been talking about you. That's haram what you're doing. It's haram. And if you think about this, look, irrational, small talk, lying, backbiting, gossip, al-fuhsh. What is al-fuhsh? It's rude, illicit speech, swearing. And unfortunately today you find Muslims that are praying 5 times a day and they're swearing. And when you say to them, brother, this is not permissible, they'll say, where does it say that we can't swear? Where do we get this from? Aisha anha said about the Prophet ﷺ, he would not speak with al-fuhsh. which is rude language. He says, وَالْجَفَاء, likewise rudeness or coldness or harshness, being harsh and crude in our speech. وَالْخُصُومَةِ وَالْمَرَاء, and al-khusuma is basically being, opposing others constantly. وَالْمَرَاء, debating. So if we want to avoid all of these things, there is a particular area of life we need to avoid. What area is that? You find all of these things, the internet. And just to be more specific, social media. If you want to avoid all of these things, avoid social media. Unless you have a social media account for the sake of business, you should not have a social media account because of the haram that takes place on those platforms. Be it Instagram, be it Snapchat, be it the new one, I can't remember what it's called, be it Twitter, used to be, or X, TikTok. There's another one as well, released by Instagram. It's like their version of Twitter.
Threads.
Sorry? Threads. All of it, same thing. All of it, same thing. You go on these platforms, what do you see? Gossip, slandering, backbiting, rudeness, crudeness, and it's all in the name of entertainment. But what are we putting into our hearts? Your heart is a utensil. The Prophet ﷺ gave us the analogy of the heart being like a utensil. When you consume food, what happens to your stomach? It gets bigger. Likewise, your heart. What are you filling your heart with? How do you fill your heart? How do you fill your heart? It's a real question. What do you use to fill your heart? Eyes and ears. Your eyes and your ears. And so if you're filling your heart with your eyes and your ears constantly on these platforms, what are you filling your heart with? Most of it is filth. And people say, oh, but I use it for reminders. How many reminders have you seen on Instagram or Snapchat that you've actually applied in your life? You see a 1 minute reminder about Qiyam al-Layl and you get up and you pray Qiyam. Does that really happen? And if you would like reminders, open a book. That will suffice you. If you really need to listen to lectures, listen to YouTube. It's more specific. And don't go on YouTube Shorts. Same thing. It's the same thing.
Would you call someone to stay away from YouTube, like for the most part, or only stick to educational content? Because it's all the same homepage. You can have so many.
Exactly.
Recommended.
Exactly. So unless I think you can turn off recommendations on YouTube. You can turn off. I know on the phone you can. So on mine, I have it. I'm not sure how I did it, but in the settings, you can turn off recommendations. So when you go into the YouTube app, it's just the search box. And so you have to put into the YouTube what you would like to watch. But then if you just scroll sideways, the shorts are there, and etc. So a person who has control over himself or herself, they can use YouTube, etc. to a degree. But the problem with these platforms is that they have been designed for you to not have any control. They have been designed for you to have a lack of control over yourself. They are highly addictive. And they hire psychologists to help them to design these apps that know how our brains work better than we know how our brains work ourselves. They collect data based upon your searches, your interests, etc. And they throw that data back at you when you open up these Instagram, Snapchat, YouTube platforms, etc. And so a person who wants to fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should delete these things from their phone. That's the conclusion. Much Islamic content today is just drama, packaged as Islamic. It's just drama, backbiting, gossiping, slandering, lying. There's no difference between that and Turkish drama show or Bollywood, whatever you want to pick your poison. He says, وَإِلْزَامُهُ السُّكُوتِ. So what's the best thing a person should do? Remain silent as much as possible. But we have to contextualize that, reminding ourselves this was written 1,000 years ago, where people perhaps did not speak as much as we speak today. And again, this was also authored for a particular type of people, students of knowledge and those who are aspiring towards scholarship in Islam. And so, al-ilzam bis-sukut, to remain silent as much as possible. We don't become rude. People are talking to us and we ignore them. No. but we try to develop a consciousness in our speech. A consciousness in our speech. We are aware of what we're saying, and we are aware of the halal and the haram in that which we say. The speech is good, of course, depending on the way that it's used. He says, وشغله بذكر الله سبحانه وتعالى وتلاوة القرآن فهذا صوم اللسان. A person should busy their tongue with the remembrance of Allah Azza wa Jal and recitation of the Quran. And that is how a person fasts with the tongue. So we fast with the tongue by abstaining from haram speech in brief, and by busying it with dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and recitation of the Quran. He says, عن مجاهد قال خصلتان تفسدان الصيام الغيبة والكذب. Mujahid, one of the tabi'een, he said 2 things which destroy a person's fasting: backbiting and lying. And there are some people, Allahumma musta'an, they are compulsive liars. He says, وقال عليه الصلاة والسلام إنما الصوم جنة فإذا كان أحدكم صائما فلا يرفث ولا يجهل وإن امرؤ قاتله أو شاتمه فليقل إني صائم. And this exercise here is very important, and there is an element of our practicing of Islam which is related to this, which you can perhaps refer to as emotional maturity. What does it look like? The Prophet ﷺ, he said fasting is a shield. It's a protection. Therefore, if one of you is fasting, he should not engage in evil speech, nor should he engage in acts or speech of ignorance. And if a person قاتله, wants to fight him, قاتل doesn't literally mean fight physically. قاتل can be used to mean argue, or basically to oppose, etc. أو شاتمه, or he becomes abusive, فليقل, then this person should say إني صائم, I am fasting. So where is the emotional maturity here? The emotional maturity here is that a person does not personalize that which they receive from others of abuse or bad behavior. And this is something which, if you can apply this in your life, you will find your life will be different in so many ways, especially your relationships. Those of us that are married, emotional maturity is very important. If a married person, if their spouse shouts at them or is abusive towards them, and when I say abusive, I don't mean swearing at, no, we're not justifying abuse, but I mean maybe they're stressed out. They say, oh, you're always this, you're always that, and so on and so forth. They shouldn't personalize it. They should say perhaps they've had a bad day. Let them cool down, give them their space. Don't personalize the matter. And we do this naturally with children. If a 3-year-old, if your child says to you, I hate you, do you take him seriously or take her seriously? You don't. Many of us will just laugh, knowing that the child is upset and they're being a bit over the top. But when it comes to adults, we personalize everything. We personalize. If a person says, I hate you, we personalize it. And that's not the correct approach. It should be that we say to ourselves, the person must be having a bad time, and we make excuses for them. Then he says, الثالث, the third is كف السمع عن الإصغاء إلى كل مكروه لأن كل ما حرم قوله حرم الإصغاء إليه ولذلك سوى الله عز وجل بين المستمع وآكل السحت فقال تعالى سماعون للكذب أكالون للسحت. So he says the third is that a person abstains from listening to that which is disliked by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or haram. He says everything which is impermissible for us to say is likewise impermissible for us to listen to. And that's a principle. If it's not permissible for me to swear, then it's not permissible for me to listen to someone swearing. If it's not permissible for me to backbite, it's not permissible for me to listen to someone backbiting. If it's not permissible for me to engage in gossiping, it's not permissible for me to listen to someone who's engaging in gossiping. And so maybe I'm not engaging in the gossiping myself, but I shouldn't be watching it. Then he says, for that reason, Allah Azza wa Jal, He weighs the two as equal. The one who listens to haram and the one who consumes haram. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, سَمَّعُونَ لِلْكَذِبِ, those who are listening to lies and that which is impermissible to listen to. أَكَّلُونَ لِلسُّحْتِ, and those who devour that which is unlawful. وقال عز وجل لولا ينهاهم الربانيون والأحبار عن قولهم الإثم وأكلهم السحت. When speaking about those who came before us, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rebuking them says, why don't the men of God, why don't the righteous people, the religiously trained people, prevent them and prohibit them from saying that which is sinful and consuming that which is unlawful? And so listening to it, saying it, speaking it, consuming it, it's all haram. فَالسُّكُوتُ عَلَى الْغِيبَةِ حَرَامٌ. And this is something which many of us fail to realize. السُّكُوتُ عَلَى الْغِيبَةِ حَرَامٌ. It's not just that ghiba is haram, but remaining silent while someone else is backbiting is haram. If someone backbites another person in front of me, I should say to them, brother, sister, ittaqillah, fear Allah. And I should defend my brother or sister's honor just as I would like my honor to be defended. And if I have a friend who is offended by me telling them ittaqillah, it's not a good friend. That's not a good friend. Arrogance. A person who has a friend who says to them ittaqillah, fear Allah, they should be happy. And we should be happy to hear our friends tell us ittaqillah, fear Allah. Why? Because that's a friend who is concerned for our akhirah. Many of us, we don't want such friends. And we've spoken about this before. Many of us, we don't want friends that tell us to fear Allah. We want friends that justify our behavior. Yes men. And the worst friend is a yes man. The one who justifies your behavior for you and makes you feel good about what you're doing even when you're in the wrong. That's not a friend. That's someone that doesn't care about you. He says, الرابع كف بقية الجوارح عن الآثام من اليد والرجل عن المكاره وكف البطن عن الشبهات وقت الإفطار فلا معنى للصوم وهو الكف عن الطعام الحلال ثم الإفطار على الحرام فمثال هذا الصائم مثال من يبني قصرا ويهدم مصرا. So he says the fourth is to abstain with the rest of the limbs from haram, as we mentioned, whether it's the hand or the foot or so on and so forth. And he says the one who is engaging in haram with their limbs whilst fasting is like a person who is building a castle whilst destroying a city. You're destroying a city, but you're building a castle. What benefit is there to that? You're losing in order to gain. And the gain is not equal to that which you're losing. He says, قال النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام كم من صائم ليس له من صومه إلا الجوع والعطش. How many a fasting person only has from their fasting? Hunger and thirst. فقيل هو الفطر على الحرام وقيل هو الذي يفطر على لحوم الناس بالغيبة. It has been said about this hadith, it's the one who eats haram to break his fast. And it's also been said that it's the one who breaks his fast with ghiba. He's not actually eating meat, he's eating the meat of his brothers and sisters, the flesh of his brothers and sisters because of his ghiba. What did the Prophet ﷺ say to Mu'adh ibn Jabal, if I'm not mistaken? He said that a person will be thrown into the hellfire on their face for that which they say with their tongue. And when he said, Awsini, the Prophet ﷺ said, Kuf alayka hadha. He said, he held his tongue and he said, abstain from this. Protect yourself from this. And the companion said, are we going to be thrown into the hellfire for what we say? Are we going to be held accountable? Prophet ﷺ said, will anyone be thrown into the hellfire on their faces except for that which they say with their tongues? Meaning, a great amount of people are going to be thrown into the hellfire for the ghiba that they engage in, the namima that they engage in, the buhtan that they engage in. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive us. Then he goes on to al-khamis, and this is generally speaking. He says, ألا يستكثر من الطعام الحلال وقت الإفطار بحيث يمتلئ جوفه فما من وعاء أبغض إلى الله عز وجل من بطن ملئ من حلال. So he says, the fifth thing that he should avoid is that he should not eat as much food as possible when he breaks his fast. He should. The whole point in fasting is to abstain from eating, not to engage in as much eating as possible. And he says this is a mistake that many people make. Because they've been fasting, they try to catch up with all of the food that they've missed. And so instead of having breakfast, lunch, and dinner spread out, they have breakfast, lunch, and dinner all at the same time. And he says, فَمَا مِنْ وِعَاءٍ أَبْغَضُ إِلَى اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ مِنْ بَطْنٍ مُلِئَ مِنْ حَلَالٍ. There is nothing more detestable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than a stomach that has been filled with halal. And this is a point that we've been speaking about for a while now. Those of us that are living lifestyles of non-Muslims but we halalify those lifestyles. We overeat, we overdrink, we oversleep, we overconsume, and we justify it. We say it's all halal, it's halal. Halal provision, halal food, halal clothing. Yes, but you're consuming too much. That itself leads to haram, al-israf, being excessive and engaging in luxury and so on and so forth. The Prophet ﷺ did not eat that much. The Sahaba did not eat that much. And many of us, we eat constantly, and not only that, but constantly eating out, constantly going to these halal restaurants, etc., etc. This is not the way of a Muslim. It's not the lifestyle of a Muslim. It's not the lifestyle of Islam. Constantly ordering takeaway, spending £5 on you know, I don't want to expose people. Someone might say £5 is cheap, but £5 for a bubble tea, for example, like this is excessive. It's excessive. £3 feeds a family for an entire week in some Muslim countries, and I'm going to spend £5 on a colored tea with some balls in it. Like, it's not something we should be engaging in as Muslims. We should be staying away from such things. Spending X amount of money on trainers constantly, the same pair of trainers in different colors, 200, 300, 400 pounds. Spending excessive amounts of money on technology. Every time there's a new phone, I need it. Every time there's a new watch, I need it. Every time there's a new coat, I need it. 800 pounds on a coat here, 900 pounds on a top there. What's this? And we say it's halal income, halal. The lifestyle is haram. That's the problem. You're building a haram lifestyle with halal components. It's haram. The Western lifestyle is a lifestyle which we should not be engaging in. Consumerism and capitalism. We don't follow such things. We follow Islam. Islam. To abstain from the dunya, to detach from the dunya, to cut ourselves away from the dunya, to wait for the akhirah. Not to build in this life as if we're going to be here forever. No, if we build in this life as if we're going to be here forever, it's not for our sake, it's for the sake of our ummah. And so what he's talking about here is a very important point, because it's not only in fasting, it's generally speaking. There are some of us, we eat out every day. We eat out all the time. Some perhaps eating out for lunch, eating out for dinner. Spending excess amounts of money on food in restaurants, whilst you have Muslims that are starving. Forget Muslims around the world, Muslims in the UK that can't afford to pay their bills. We are a collective, we're not individuals. And the Western lifestyle is an individualistic lifestyle. It's a self-centered lifestyle. It wasn't always like that, but capitalism and consumerism has corrupted the Western lifestyle. Now it's falling apart. As Muslims, we should stand away from that, and we should say, no, this is how we live as Muslims. We have values. Even when it comes to money, just because I have it, it doesn't mean I need to spend it. Because I can afford an £800 coat, it doesn't mean I need to buy it. I can buy a coat for £50, it does the same thing as the £800 one, unless I'm going to the Antarctic. And he goes on to speak about this issue in a bit more detail. He says, so what we'll do is we'll stop there, inshallah, because it's nearly Maghrib, and then we'll continue bi'ithnillah. Most likely we'll continue after August. So most likely this evening will be the last until after August, inshallah, just for the summer holidays. So there'll be other things going on, inshallah.